Good afternoon. I am Jasenka Gojšić, CARNet Chief Executive Officer, and it's my great honor to be the chairman of the first session on the joint TERENA and CARNet Users Conference 2003. It's my honor to welcome Minister of Science and Technology, Professor Gvozden Flego, David Williams, TERENA President of Executive Committee, distinguished speakers, representatives of national research networks, and dear participants. The title of the conference, Users' Opportunities, Network Challenges, has imposed a real challenge to the Joint Programme Committee. They have been balancing the technological with user aspects and have successfully managed to attract all of us with a rich and complete programme. The excellent results of the intensive collaboration among virtual team members have certainly depended on the skills of team leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Shirley Wood and Mr. Miroslav Milinović, Programme Committee Chairpersons. Ms. Wood.
On behalf of TERENA and as co-chair of the Programme Committee, I would like to welcome you to the joint TERENA Networking Conference 2003 and the CARNet Users Conference 2003. The theme of this conference is User Opportunities, Network Challenges, which will reflect the fact that this year's conference is a joint event with sessions aimed at both the user and the technical networking communities within Europe. In the early days of the Internet, the users of the services were the researchers and engineers who had a requirement to develop many of the basic services that subsequent applications have been built upon. However, as the Internet has become a commodity service, users now feel that they receive services that the technical experts want to deliver, rather than those the user wants. One could argue that the network developers are delivering services which the user must have to ensure reliable and secure access and therefore protection to the user. It is important that these two diverse communities of users and technical experts come together to discuss the common ground between them and to identify the user requirements and the solutions that the network engineers and developers can deliver. The Internet is now being used to deliver teaching and learning to a wide audience, whose requirements are different from those in the research community. The research community are looking for bigger, better and faster Internet access, while lecturers wanting to deliver teaching and learning to a variety of students at any time of the day or night are looking for a reliable means of delivering their material. As service providers, we have to look at the diverse requirements of the users of our services, and this may mean delivering a variety of services to different audiences. One of the major problems we face as service providers is identifying the users and their requirements. In many cases, we interface with the computer centre within an organisation and therefore do not come into contact with the real users unless we ourselves go and talk to them. The Programme Committee have identified this as an area to be looked at during this joint conference. The first European Networking Conference took place in Luxembourg in 1985. I wonder how many of you in the audience attended that first event and can reflect on the network and the services that have changed since that time. Annual networking conferences have taken place since 1985 to bring together the network developers and engineers involved in advancing the Internet for the benefit of education and research. These annual conferences are an important occasion for many networking staff, as it gives them the opportunity to come together to discuss new applications, new services, new technologies, as well as the perennial problems of security, quality of service and scalability. I hope that this 2003 conference will be a successful event and allow an understanding to develop between the users and the network developers. I hope you, the delegates, find the conference useful, informative and enjoyable. And I will now pass you to the co-chair of the programme committee, Miroslav, who's going to give you more detail of what the programme contains.
Thank you, Shirley, and warm welcomes from the other part of the team, from the CARNet side. I'm very glad to see many of you in here, and warm welcomes to all the distinguished guests and the speakers as well as the participants. So I'm here to say a few more words about the program, about the details, and yes, we've put together two sides of a coin, two worlds. One is the TNC networkers world, so the techies world, that is looking towards the network challenges. And the other one is CUC, CARNet's world, or the world of CARNet's conference, that goes there and looks what are the opportunities for the users. So that is the basic reason why the program committee this year gives that title to the conference. And when we thought about the topics, and having in mind that they should be attractive both to the users as well as the techies or technicians, the ones who are developing the network services, we thought about the access, authorization, authentication, accessing the resources. We also thought about sharing the same stuff, end-to-end, peer-to-peer. We thought about the security, because all of this has to be secure in a way. We thought about the integration, of course, and normally it shouldn't be a Terena conference without these technologies for advanced networking. And it turned out to the very interesting and complemented program you will be experiencing these few days that has, as usual, I would say, middleware topics, grid and peer-to-peer, IPv6 and advanced networks, mobility and security, multimedia and video conferencing, and last but not the least, new applications and user services. I think that this puzzle is interesting enough, so you'll spend a very interesting and nice conference with us. Just a few information from the organization point of view. Our core program is complemented with plenty of meetings, workshops, and boths, and I think that aside of the core program, the conference is interesting due to that also. Be advised, this is, as far as I know, the first time that we don't have only terminal room, we have video conferencing facilities on your behalf. So if you want to have a video conferencing with your home, just contact the staff. Also, there is a wireless LAN possibilities and coffee break served not only at this level but also on the 17th floor. And last but not the least, all the informations, including the streaming services available on our website. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'd like to thank Program Committee, Terena and CARNet staff for a great program, and for all of us, let's enjoy the joint conference. Thank you very much.
It is a unique privilege to host such an event. May I invite Professor Ignac Lovrek, the chairman of the CARNet board, to greet the respected audience on behalf of CARNet.
Dame i gospodo, cijenjeni gosti, kolege i prijatelji, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. First of all, I would like to tell you briefly what Croatian Academic and Research Network CARNet is. Let me start with a few words regarding CARNet's history. CARNet started out as a project of the Ministry of Science and Technology in September 1991. The first international internet connection was established on 17 November 1992. While .hr domain was introduced on 27 December 1993. So this year's conferences are somewhat special due to the fact that they celebrate 10th anniversary of the CARNet. The past decade has brought many changes in terms of development, prospects and applications of the Croatian Academic and Research Network. ATN technology was introduced in 1995. Computer Emergency Response Team started in 1996. The first CARNet user conference was held in 1999. Since July 2002, GEANT POP and international internet connection with 622 megabits per second have been in operation. This year, CARNet has received distinguished international and professional recognition through the opportunity to host TERENA networking conference. The conference program we have will help CARNet to foster new activities. A key element will be hearing views and recommendations on ways how to strengthen academic networking and open new user opportunities. CARNet's goal is to operate a high quality academic and research network and at the same time broaden its scope in addressing new topics and introducing new technologies, services and applications. We would like to offer the Croatian academic and research community fast, secure, content-rich and collaborative environment. The most important of the current projects that exemplifies our efforts is GigaCarnet. Its aim is to start with a gigabit network within and between the biggest universities in Osijek, Rijeka, Split and Zagreb in 2003. GigaCarnet's full deployment is expected in the next 3 years. Regarding services, GigaCarnet will offer standard and premium IP service, virtual private networking, and end-to-end multicasting, as well as services that require network intelligence. Keywords describing the projects correspond to the title of sub-projects: network, video, traffic, IP6. We strongly believe that this initiative will be recognized by telecom operators, ISPs, and other organizations and companies as a neutral basis for investigating, developing, and piloting new technologies and services in Croatia, not only for the academic and research community, but for the community at large as well. The excellent conference program we have would have not been possible without the efforts of the International Program and Organizing Committee. Shirley and Miroslav and their team did a great job. Our sincere thanks go to the many people whose cooperation and enthusiasm made this conference a success. We are very grateful for the generous support from the Ministry of Science and Technology of the Republic of Croatia and many sponsors that recognize the importance of academic networking for overall development of knowledge society. Once again, welcome to TERENA Networking Conference and CARNet User Conference, and enjoy your stay in Zagreb and Croatia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Lovrek. It is time to officially open the conference. It is my privilege to invite Minister of Science and Technology, Minister of Science and Technology, Professor Gvozden Flego, to announce the beginning of the joint TERENA Conference and CARNet User Conference 2003. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
First of all, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored and I have a pleasure to be with you today at the conference, joint conference of TERENA and CARNet. Since you heard already essential data about CARNet, let me say and let me stress that Croatia understands quite well the importance of communication and information technologies and invests very much in the infrastructure, being aware that the communication is essential for teaching and learning, but as well as for exchange of ideas and research results among scientists and researchers. Above that, we pay the most attention to, so to say, investment to human resources. And this conference is one of the proofs of that. I am very happy and proud that our researchers, our colleagues, our experts in communication technologies organized this conference in such a way, and I hope that it will run in the best possible way. Wishing you a pleasant stay in Zagreb and very fruitful conference. Allow me to proclaim this conference open. Thank you.
I would like to present our sincere thanks to Mr. Minister. Consider this conference open. Let the program begin. I have great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Veltman and his presentation, A Grid for Culture. Mr. Veltman, welcome, and please take the floor.
Puno vam hvala. Dama i gospodo, velike je čast biti ovdje i moram se ispričati što vas mogu pozdraviti na hrvatskom.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be here. A few years ago, if one said I'm just a user, what was just that? It is very kind of you to have patience to listen to a mere user. The internet is changing rapidly, and I'm going to talk very briefly about these 6 little points. First of all, the technology, about which you are experts, but most of us don't stand still to think that there are 7 billion new pages a day, 2.1 billion pages on the surface web, and something like 550 billion pages now on the deep web, if you include the databases. We hear about the dot-com bust and the fact that the internet stopped, more or less, around 2000 in a certain continent of the world. What we forget is that in 2000 there were 200 million, and as of May this year there are 650 million, and there will be 700 million by the end of the year. That means we've had 500 million new users in 3 years. When I was growing up, we used to make great stories about how long it took the first 50 million users in telephones and television and so on. But we've had 500 million new users in 3 years, not 100 years. And the prediction is that by the end of next year, we'll be up to 940 million. The language scene has changed radically as well. In 1995, 98% was English. In 2002, it was 40%. This year, it's 35.2%. The second language on the internet is Chinese, the third is Japanese, and the fourth is Spanish. If we look at it in a slightly different point of view, there was a, you went, yes, sorry, my phone. We see that English now is about 35. The 4 major non-European languages are 29%, and the major European languages are about 26%. I think this starts to relativize our position in the world. Here is a prediction from the Japanese in the year 2000. The internet is that little black dot in 2005, and in 2010 it's the whole thing. This was considered radical at first. Now it's generally accepted by the major thinkers, even in other parts of the world. What that means is that these great big screens and the tiny screens and the things we have in our Docomo and iMode and UTMN and so on will all become one. Here is Philip's notion of the pre-ambient intelligence world, where we have lots of Philips televisions, lots of Philips video recorders, and of course lots of remotes. Within 3 to 5 years, 10 at the most, the window will become your projection screen, and also then your screensaver. But this is only the start of a revolution that is absolutely amazing. If you go to the site of the MITRE Corporation, you will find that in nanocomputing there are 4 major trends: electronic, biochemical, mechanical, and quantum. I don't want to go in all the details here because that would be amazingly difficult. But here is a quote from the BBC News of the 12th of January 2000. 1 gram of dry DNA can hold as much information as 1 trillion CD-ROMs. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, for the purposes of clarity, I'm speaking Canadian this afternoon, but I do speak English. This means that ambient intelligence means that every object of culture can have its own computer that can describe its own history. And we could easily talk for the next hour about that statement, but I want to go on. Because I want to tell you, first of all, about the changing world of scanning. Well, books are now being scanned in at 767 megabytes a page. That means that the Gutenberg Bible in the 5th version, because Kyoto has done one of the, no, Keio University did one of the first. We have a copy at Cambridge. We have a copy at the British Library. We have a copy at Göttingen. But now the Library of Congress, bigger and better, is doing half a terabyte for 1 book. So we have, this is a copy of the one in Göttingen, and this is not the quality that you would have if you had that amount, but you can imagine what it would be like. Well, paintings are now being scanned in at 30 gigabytes per picture, with 24 pictures in major cases. So Mona on steroids, so to speak. We have created extraordinarily new cameras like the Thomson Flat Scanner. This was produced in 1990. Between 1996 and 2001, 140,000 photo archives were digitized at 6 by 8,000 lines. This is leading to it's not just a matter of new snapshots and your new little digital camera that you carry around. This is leading to a whole new definition of the color palette in the Chrysotel project, for example. So this is the variety that you had before. This is the variety we have now. Again, we could easily have a lecture of an hour on this, but what I am saying is that the revolution in color printing that is taking place as a result of the scanning is greater than the revolution of the entire 19th century. We are also now taking not 1 snapshot, but 24 snapshots. Here is from the Centre de Recherche et Illustration des Musées de France in the basement of the Louvre. 24 pictures of this Polynesian object, or here of this Chinese bronze, or here, and this is the fascinating thing, we now have X-rays so that we can look inside a calabash, or here an accordion. And I'm not even talking about the more complicated things with X-ray refractography and so on. So this gives you a very brief summary of the kind of growth that we've been having in the last decade. Now, what is happening? Why do we want all this, and what do we use this for? Well, here's some of the things that are happening. The Japanese, Dr. Kamiyuchi at Hitachi, for example, is interested in how you take this and digitally reconstruct the original color of a hokusai. At the Institute for the Fundamentele Onderzoek voor Materia, or the fundamental study of matter at the university in Amsterdam, at SARA, we have a virtual laboratory, so you can start to do online virtual laboratory stuff for restoration. And one of the great aha moments of my life was at INET 2000 in your country, sir, Yokohama, where a quiet gentleman sat down with a laptop, called up the supercomputer at San Diego, opened the electron tunneling microscope, and actually did an experiment using a regular laptop, and there he was running a $10 million machine. And I suddenly realized this is another world. Well, what else is happening? Well, there's a new hope for contextualization. because some of us think it's just a question of going to Google, writing in images, and then getting an image. But here's a well-known painting, Carpaccio. That's not the thing that you eat for an hors d'oeuvre. He was a painter. This is in the Museo Correa in Venezia. Here is another painting by the same man, now in the Getty Museum in Malibu. And if you put those two together, you see that in fact they saw the thing in half and made a bit more money by selling a half to the Americans. This is a well-known tradition of the 19th century, but now with digital reconstructions, we can literally piece things together in a new way. So you see the wonderful thing that was shown about the puzzle has new applications. It means that we can check a painting that was done in the north and how that was copied or applied in Italy. We always hear about how the Italians influenced the north, but actually it went both ways. We all know about Claude Debussy and La Mer, the sea and not his mother. But what most of us don't realize is that this actually comes from Poussin. And again, it's only when we start to have access to a global view of culture that we realize the intertwingledness of things, as Ted Nelson would more charmingly say. I take you on a very simple example for a couple of minutes to a painter that we think we all know. His name, of course, is Claude Monet. He liked haystacks and the things therein, but that's beyond the scope of this lecture. He did a nice landscape, so you see that he does one theme and repeats it. Well, then he goes to live at Giverny, which we all know about, and there's this little garden, and then he studies Japanese bridges. You see, I have a great respect, and so did he, for your tradition. And he built one of these Japanese things, and then he started to paint it. And he paints it again, and again. And then, in the best tradition, add a second floor. So he did that, and then he started to paint that, and this. And I think that's the last, yes, I'm sorry, back. Now this is, to me, very interesting, because there are about 80 books on Mr. Monet, and there's not one place that you will find this sequence. Now, we normally hear about the history of modern art. Yes, there was this terrible thing called realism. It was terribly boring. And one day, there was a great awakening. And the spirit of the modern came upon them, and they cast away the past, and they created the modern. And here we see this little gentleman, not so little actually, living in the French countryside, spends 30 years painting a bridge, and in the course of those 30 years, he invents, he's called an impressionist, but this is rather post-impressionist. Basically, we're almost to the complete discovery of the abstract. Now, this is an art history that unless we have these things in context, unless we can see how these things develop, then we can never understand how this started with a Japanese bridge that was all neat and tidy. Now, that's not saying that the one is better, simply that there is a continuity that we hadn't seen before. Well, there are lots of other things happening. Infobite, a company in Rome with whom we went to the G7, has recreated. This is a bad slide of something that is better seen on a Silicon Graphics Infinity machine. But what's interesting about this is that they didn't just scan the pictures, they scanned the space of the pictures so that you could walk through the space of an event that happened in 847 and was painted in 1508. This was a fire in the suburbs of the Vatican. But it means that we could literally walk through the spaces of the great paintings of, and if we were dealing with the grandfather of the gentleman who became the apothecary of Zagreb in 1399, I'm speaking, of course, of Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy. We could literally, if someone said, go to hell, we could literally walk through the extraordinary drawings of Botticelli and others. There is an enormous field emerging called reconstructions. Well, here's an example of Cluny, which was done by IBM, first of all with IBM and the Institut National de l'Audiovisuel, then with the Centre d'Enseignement et de Recherche de Cluny, or ENSAM, and they did wonderful pictures like this. This was before Martin Feldman did Lightscape and so on. This was really very impressive, and there was even an electronic guide in the form of a monk. There was only one problem. It was historical, and it was based on an American who had studied in Paris but was considered too American by the real historians. So the Österreichische Landesregierung, Abteilung Kultur und Wissenschaft, decided they would get it right and show wie es eigentlich gewesen, as Leopold von Ranke would have said. Well, and they did a nice version, but then the Technische Universität Darmstadt, well known for its cultural traditions and especially its technology, did their version. Then Walder and Trüb, without being trübselig, did this version, and soon they put that into the landscape, and we can imagine how it's like. This is their version of the interior. This is now the comparison between the German and the Franco-IBM version. Now, I'm interested in this because I'm trying to teach my students about what is truth. This is one of my great problems in life. It's an outmoded notion and so on. But how do you tell which of those is the better one of a building that Napoleon cleansed when he was doing his revolutionary things? So we really need, and this is one of the reasons I'm trying to build this network, with a book it's pretty simple. I have a book and then I check the references of bibliography to see if it's okay. With an electronic book, I have to have the hardware and software. But with these new electronic reconstructions, I need to have the authenticity and veracity parameters, digital watermarks. Is it real? And then the methodological basis. Whose theory is it based on? What are the documents that this is going back to? Is this fancy, or is it based on real texts or real images? But that's only the beginning of the methodological problems that face us. Let me take you very briefly to the Museo Virtual de Artes El País, MUVA, where we have this charming lady, and we'll step inside. And I'm going to go very quickly, so fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to go, so this is the front of the room. I'm now going to go around the room. Okay, ready? Here we go. So now we're here, yes. Now we're there. Now we're there. We're back. There, and we're back in the front. Easy. Well, this is a perfect example of a virtual museum, except there's a slight problem. This building does not exist. This is a collection of painters from Uruguay who are considered politically incorrect and who are actually forbidden from having a building and actually forbidden from existing, more or less. So they exist in this form. Now, so we have a new methodological problem. In 50 years, if you don't know that little detail, how are you going to distinguish this between this and a local museum that you're familiar with? And more interesting, how are we going to get, this is already on the internet today, but imagine if we had this on a gigabyte thing that you could actually study all the details perfectly. How do we know the veracity of that which does not exist in physicality? I'm not here to answer, simply to give you intellectual indigestion after lunch. Contextualization of space and time. Well, what's happening now is quite amazing. At the Expo Pavilion in 2000, a company called De Pinxi did a reconstruction of this fabulous thing of Mexico at Teotihuacan, or here at the Expo in, this is now a virtual recreation of ancient Sorabol and in Korea. Or here's an Indian example. What I'm trying to make clear to you is that there was a time that you could say, oh yes, culture, that's something that happens, you know, those Italians or the French with their frogs and so on, or sometimes the Teutons do these things, and also the British have their own version. But now it is truly international. It was a great eye-opener to me when I went to Beijing last year with the Commission, and we were told about some projects, and one of them was the classics of the Chinese language, 800 million characters in Unicode, in 8 dialects, not a plan, done. The Emperor's Library, a mere 400 million characters in Unicode, done. not a plan done. They found the virtual reality things in the United States a bit too expensive, so what did they do? They created their own reconstruction of the whole of Beijing so that they can fly through and prepare for 2008. But a lot more is happening. Last year I was invited to open a new Center for Digital Interpretation in Falun. To be quite honest, I was not intimately connected with Falun until that time. I learned that this was the place where 70% of all copper was developed for the whole of Europe until about 50 years ago. Well, what's interesting here, virtual reality is being used not just to reconstruct the place, but to reconstruct the whole process of how you make copper. And they're starting to work on comparative projects of how Swedish copper production was different from the German ones at, say, Göttingen or so on. And this is part of a much wider thing. So I have a colleague, Professor José Ignacio de Royas in Spain, who is doing a virtual network of olive press machines. The people in Bologna are reconstructing how you do silk production from 1600 to about 1750, which was what made Bologna the richest city of Europe at that time. I'm giving these very concrete, seemingly weird examples to make it clear that this is not just, a plan someday they're going to do this. No, these exist. There are thousands of these reconstructions, and they're coming out by the week. Here's one that's come out in the last month and has caused some circles. This is a project at Warwick in England. They have reconstructed the Theatre of Pericles, which is, of course, that Odeon, not the cinema, but the first theatre on the kind of on the cliff, the first cliffhanger in the real sense in the Acropolis of Athens. What's interesting, they've reconstructed what it would have looked like inside and decided that only 40% of the people could see the scene properly unless they had the right tickets. Oh, this is interesting. So this is a project in Italy, one of the most amazing ones called NUME, Nuovo Museo Elettronico, where they're, and how it got turned upside down, I don't know, we'll see. But basically we have the center of town, and you take the city from the year 1000 right to the present, and you follow that same city through 1,000 years. And this is a 5 terabyte example. A project in Santi, the Santi project in Spain takes us with satellite images over over Galicia, over cities like La Coruña, and takes us right down so that we can walk through the streets of Santiago de Compostela. There's been an enormous shift in the museum, because 20 years ago the focus was on the object. So I'd have this statue here and I'd try to scan this statue, or especially a beautiful female statue. And then it was the virtual museum, and then it was the Musée Imaginaire in the sense of André Malraux. And then we realized, no, we want to get the virtual site, and then the virtual city, as I've just shown you. But now there's an interest in the cultural landscape and the cultural route. And so here I take an example from China. This is on the web today, the Yellow Mountains White Cloud Stream scenic area, where the interest is not on the man-made, but on places that man has made interesting because of complex reasons. Or to take, now for something completely different, the Aboriginal cultural landscape in Darren Sound, Canada, where the emphasis is not on the buildings that man put there, but on the holy site before people even got there. So culture has moved away from those objects, those dead objects that were lying around in museums, to in fact being the whole landscape and environment. And there is a great fascination now with the cultural routes, like the routes that lead to Santiago de Compostela, which of course is why we got Romanesque art and why we got, to a certain extent, the development of the Gothic when the cathedral at Cologne was copied at Burgos, and so on. I'm just going to have some gin and tonic. One of the most interesting developments in this field, as you know, UNESCO spent most of the 90s working on a study of the old Silk routes and has produced some amazing volumes on that. Well, in 2000, the National Institute of Informatics, again in Japan, Professor Kinji Ono, created an Asian network of digital Silk roads. They have made accords formally with UNESCO. There are similar accords with the Chinese Cultural Heritage Network in Beijing. There is the Americans, in the best old tradition of imitating Europe. I've been talking about the need for cultural grids now for 3 years. Well, of course, this spring, the Americans told us that it already exists. The NSF, the National Science Foundation, has now got their American cultural grids for the digital Silk roads. Now, what's interesting here is that we have projects then in Japan, China, the United States, and in Europe, working together not just to make a site that shows you some of these things, but to use digital means to reinvent and to make us aware in new ways of the way culture was shared between East and West over many thousands of years. You will recall that when a man called Aristotle decided that he needed a better set of samples about the particulars of reality, he sent his best student called Alexander the Great to go to India and get him some nice new stones and new plants, many of which were not superseded until studies in botany in the year 1927. So this is one of the more fascinating things that's happening. I want to go very briefly about some of the challenges that you, who are the techies and who solve everything, still have in front of you. In the 19th century, there were people like Otlet and La Fontaine who started the notion of secondary literature in a serious way, and they had a vision of an Encyclopedia Universalis Mundaneum, that everything was going to go to one spot in Brussels. This was before the European Union. This was the Pacte du Centenaire, and from this has come the whole notion of international bibliography that we have, such as IBZ, the Internationale Bibliographie der Zeitschriften, Literatur und so weiter. Now, what we've realized in the last century, and this is really one of the things that's getting to me more and more, you know, when you hear the hype of the world, the manufacturers behind your field, you would think that it's all been done. That, you know, we have all those machines, it's all just bigger and better and, you know, faster and all that. And then when you talk to the frontiers, you've discovered, the physicists among you have discovered that no machine in the world is big enough for your Hadron Collider. The radio astronomists will tell you that only 1% of their experiments can be done. They have to throw away 99% of their material because the machines aren't big enough. And the cultural people have to tell you that, well, as I said, most of this is not available. And we're supposed to be teaching about the future, and we can't even show the present. But so we need, but in culture we need not just the official story, not just that one rule that applies everywhere in the world. We need to get different viewpoints about the same thing. So we need to have the story at the local, the regional, the national, the international, and the global level. And here there's been very interesting work. Oh, there's a typo, I apologize. There has been a development towards what are called DACOs, or Digital Autonomous Cultural Objects. 50 years ago, we would have assumed that what you do is create a template, and I take this template and say, now you use this, and you use this, and you use it, and if you all are good boys and girls and use that template, then everything will be fine. Well, that's fine if we're starting from scratch. But if you happen to be the Louvre, and you the British Library, and you the Royal Library in Beijing, you're not going to take 20 or 50 or 100 or 200 million objects and rewrite all your databases. So what we're getting is a certain sense of the users fight back and say, look, we've got the substance. You think you have the answers. You've got to connect us, but don't tell us to rewrite all our knowledge. So there's a very interesting shift, fundamental shift in philosophy that is linked with this shift from the centralized version to the distributed version. And that applies not only to the use of computers, but I could say to centralized regimes, and has political implications and so on. But let's get back to our topic. Well, what's fascinating is that the reconstructions are going a lot further. So there's a movie project, MUVII, that's not only concerned about taking this Greek temple, but helping you have a sense of what it would feel like. Because, of course, one of the problems in normal museums is you're never allowed to touch. But with the new technologies, we now have not only the possibility of seeing and touching, but there are things like trizincs. So there's even smell and even taste have been demonstrated to be available online. So this could create a completely different notion of what we call virtual reality and augmented reality, which is really where we're going. Here is a little object put in front of the eye. This is a development of a man called Steve Feiner, professor at Columbia. And I look at the night sky, and I have projected onto that night sky the Greek constellation. Well, the IBM likes that, so they've taken over that idea. But let's now take this one step further. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know Ursus Major, the big bear and all that. But most of you will not know what a Persian, Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, Mayan night sky looks like. But there's nothing to stop you taking this technology, looking at those lovely stars in the sky, pressing a button, and suddenly saying, if I was a Persian living in the 11th century, this is what the night sky would have looked like. So an augmented reality that in fact leads to an augmented culture that allows me to see the same object and impress upon that whole different layers of meaning and so on. So if I was looking at this wonderful statue of a Buddhist monk, I could then press a button and say, well, now if I was the Hinayana school, what would his characteristics be? Or if I was Mahayana or Tantric, or a particular Zen variety, how would he look differently? And I could then superimpose on this single statue all these things without telling him to become this or that and changing his lifestyle and interfering and so on. That is to say, these new technologies, and this is where they become very interesting. In the past we thought, well, I would come to you as a user and you'd say, oh yes, well now if you buy a Cisco switch and you do this kind of router and this kind of thing and that kind of thing, then I'll pay attention to you. Well, I don't want to hear about that. I want you to solve the problem, but then I want to be able, as a user, to use this to see the world more richly and not to impose just one culture, but to allow me to see that enormous complexity of cultures that's out there, that I, as someone who has traveled around the world, I thought I knew something. In Europe, I cope with 15 languages. I was invited by the European Commission in 1997 to come to Gifu. I arrived, and suddenly it was worse than being a child. I knew nothing. I had no language, but even worse, all the rules. I didn't know anything. Now, the business world knows about this. There are, one of my best friends spent 5 years with Bosch. He had to go through a crash course for a month to learn the basics of how you deal with a fundamental change. But we need, in fact, a whole new world where if we're really going to be international and not just reduce everything to Hiltons and McDonald's, then we have to find ways of learning to enter into all those. May I remind you that there are 6,500 languages out there. And I cope seriously with lectures in 5, and I have friends who have coped with 20, and there was a man at the Vatican who had 136, but I've met no one who's had 6,500. So somehow we need to use these tools to make a new way into this complexity that's out there. So this is ArchaeoGuide, a project done with the Germans and the Greeks. And so you're standing at a landscape, you put on the goggles, and you see what this temple would have been like before it was a ruin. But now take the next step. I want to see how the École de France à Athens, or the British Archaeological School at Athens, or the American Archaeological School, and the German Archaeological School, how the same building gets done differently in different cultures. We speak about Weltanschauung, but we could use the technologies to, in fact, allow us to see the world as a Greek, as a German, a French, or so forth. Now, there is an extraordinary world opening up. The European Union funded a project called ACTS, Advanced Communications and Technologies Services, and there was one called Digital Video Production, DVP. And there were blue rooms, of course. We all know about that the man stands in front of the weather and suddenly or he stands in front of a blue screen and suddenly he stands in front of the landscape or the weather and so on. This whole technology in the last 5 years has developed in enormous ways and is going to continue to do so. One of the most interesting examples is the supercomputing center in Italy called Cineca, which is in the outskirts of Bologna, working with Radio Televisione Italiano. This is the Casa dei Centenari in Pompeii, where we have now a reconstruction of a room in a Roman villa. Take you back a second so we can see what it looks like today. I press a button and suddenly we're standing in a bit of a reconstruction and then in a full reconstruction. Now imagine, ladies and gentlemen, the classroom of the future, which is a room maybe a little smaller than this. I just press a button and bang. Instead of saying, well, boys and girls, we're going to go to study that boring ruin called Pompeii. Ladies and gentlemen, we could just say, let's go to Pompeii, and we're in the ruin. Once you get your gigabit and terabit things in place, the first terabit connections have been demonstrated. There is talk that we could get up to 141 petabits within 10 years, because now you can get 260 megs per wire or per color, and you can get, I think, up to 1,026 colors or something. I mean, that's smoking, as they say in some parts of the world. But you know about that side much better than me. I'm here just to remind you that it's not just about little wires put in the ground, but that in fact this is about rewiring our whole view of the world if we do it right. So this is leading to the notion of virtual heritage centers, which I'll come back. But as I say, I'm here to give you indigestion and to show you why it's all a little more problematic than simply plugging in the cables and getting it to work. Another of those shock things that happened in my first shocking trip to Japan, in the best sense, was that I'd always had the notion that I knew what a picture was. In the West, we have the notion that this picture is there to entertain us, and we talk about aesthetic distance. We talk about the picture, we talk about the subject-object distinction, so that the moment we have the picture, I distinguish between me and that nice picture out there that is not me. And what we've had in the West is then a fundamental link between the development of painting and the development of not taking seriously and even treating frivolously. And again, I'm going to deal with the history of art now in about 3 minutes rather than 46 hours, which is the usual time of this lecture. But we have things like that very famous goddess Diana. Well, you honor her here with a bar, so you are well acquainted with her influences. What's fascinating in the West is that once we have drawn her seriously as a goddess, we draw her rather frivolously as a German baroness playing the part of a goddess. And in the case of Venus, who starts as a very serious topic, of which I need not persuade you, she starts as a serious topic, then she gets linked with organ players, and Mr. Freud regrets that he is not able to give you all the full implications of that, but we will go on. What's fascinating, and by the 19th century, Venus and Cupid becomes an excuse in the English tradition. This is a particular lord who was having an affair with this lady, and it was then playfully dealt with as a Venus and Cupid. And then later in the century, we get the Impressionists, and if we did not know the tradition, we would just think this is a lady on a hot day, or just a hot lady, and we would not realize that there was a whole iconographic, serious tradition behind this. So in the West, we use art to not take art and culture seriously. Then you go to Japan, and if you go to one of the greatest temples, it is not plunked. Well, in the West, if you're trying to create a big building, you get bulldozers, you scrape everything away, and then you build something. Here, it is built right in nature. And in fact, if you go to the Zen temples of Kyoto and elsewhere, you are now in a building looking out at a view of the ocean, but you are inside a building. Or here you are in the Imperial Palace, Summer Palace. That's on the southeast corner there of the west corner of the city, and suddenly you are looking out at a garden that acts as if it was a painting, but that garden is a visualization of the tale of Genji, which is a literary text. And the whole purpose of these things is not to separate me from nature, but in fact, the whole purpose of Zen is to link me with nature. So, or here, this little bit of shrubbery that has only taken 400 years to produce, is there not to separate me, but to unite me. So we have a Western tradition where the art is there to separate me, to create subject-object. In this part of the world, and especially if you go to a little further east to Russia, you have the whole iconic tradition, which links up with the Greek middle verb, because you have the icon links you, but it does not identify you. So you're somewhere between the separation of the West and the unity that happens in the East. Now, all of this is fine because I'm explaining this, but if we're throwing 7 million new pages on the internet a day, how do I teach my students that this one I'm supposed to be joined with and the next picture I'm supposed to be separated from? How are we going to really get that across in your little network protocols? I'm not here, as I say, I'm here to give you a hard time, but after all, you have all these, that's why you're so clever, you're going to solve all of this. I thought I'd just give you an example of a painting. Well, here's a very famous painting. Here is the famous waterfall on which it's based. But if you gave that painting marks in terms of how well it copied the waterfall, it would obviously not get very good marks, but you would also fail because you have not understood, you would not have understood that this is not about copying, it's about something else. So here is the real challenge. How do we create networks to share our knowledge, but then at the same time to make people aware that there are whole different worldviews, and those worldviews, the picture may look the same, but if I read this as a Westerner, as an attempt to copy, then I have not got anywhere. And then there's creativity. Well, Here again, it's very interesting. There's that lovely saying of the English about the Americans. America, a land of unlimited impossibilities, where nothing is so old as the new. And there is this notion amongst most of us, or too many of us these days, that if only we could if only we could do something completely original, if we could do something that was never been done, that's the way to creativity. Well, I was asked to talk about this a few weeks ago at another conference of the European Commission of the Art Nouveau network, which is trying to deal with this. And I take you now to 3 minutes from that lecture, because one of the paradoxes of the West, and it is a paradox that you also have in Japan and China and also India, is that the great masterpieces are not the unknown stories, but precisely the stories that we know best. A very simple example. We all know the story of the Annunciation. Effective angel messenger meets unsuspecting virgin. But look what happens with that very simple story. This is a particular one in 1486, which is quite complicated because there's that little city there, and this was done because on that day in August, that is the birth of, the date of the Annunciation, this city was given the freedom of the city, shown there. So, but here we're out in a courtyard, here we're in a different kind of courtyard, here we're in the garden, here we're in a church, and then a slight variation, and that becomes a completely different painting in a church. And then we have a different kind of church, and then a different kind of church. And in fact, I could give you thousands of examples. Just go to www.google.com images and type in Annunciations, and you'll get what would have happened to Renaissance art if topics such as the Annunciation were copyrighted. You had a gentleman last year who talked to you about some of the other implications of this. So I'm not going to repeat his lecture, but just take the same topic very briefly from a European point of view, because we find that simple topics, well-known topics like a person reading, have generated some of the most amazing works of Western art. So this was a thing I told the Commission when I was in my ordinary mood. The uniqueness of the European approach lies in a constant interplay between the enduring, collaborative, and personal knowledge, using the cumulative effects of the existing content as a basis of new content. Now, there was that lady, not quite as devout as the Virgin, but one of the modern idols, Marilyn Monroe, and a man called Mr. Warhol did various versions, and a lady at the Mira Lab called Margaret Baumann has created a virtual Marilyn here at Lake Geneva and here at the United Nations. Now this gets quite interesting because there's now an American company called Retro.com that claims, with the concept of virtual thespians, to not only have the copyright on the image of Marilyn, but a copyright on all the possible movements that Marilyn ever could have made. So my next question is, what happens to modern topics like Marilyn if they are copyrighted as virtual thespians? So I would suggest to you that there is perhaps, and I'm being now very politically incorrect, there are perhaps two ways of looking at the same story. In a certain country on another side of a pond, there is a tendency to take the notion that the enduring knowledge of libraries, museums, and archives, the collective memory institutions of mankind, somehow belong to originals and content, and that anything that is copied there is copyrighted, and that this then leads you to broadcast industries and content industries, and that this is fundamentally different from the collaborative and personal knowledge where you have a draft new that leads to a shared new collaborative design and manufacturing. So you have the creativity side gets locked on this side, and the creative old gets copyrighted, and the creative new is for design and maybe some new gadgets, but these two are separate. I would suggest to you that somehow there might be another model that says, look, we have these originals, but the Annunciation belongs to our heritage as a whole. And it's taking, we're not talking about now taking the Louvre's painting and selling it without giving the Louvre rights. That's not what we're talking about. But we're saying, I take the Louvre's painting, I work with it, create a shared new thing or a personal new thing, and this leads then to a whole new creative industry. And somehow then, we have this cumulative effect of the collective memory becomes part of all of us, rather than we take Grimm's fairy tales and copyright one version and then block all other versions, which you were told about last year. So to unleash the potentials of e-content, we must keep what was in the public sphere public and not subject it to unnecessary copyrights. I did not say we should get rid of copyright. My colleague Philippe Keogh argued that we should get rid of copyright, and unfortunately a certain country across the pond has made him quit his position at the United Nations, at UNESCO, because of this. One more example, and then the 5 hours that I'm supposed to be speaking will be nearing an end. Because in a funny way, we're coming back to the notion of universals and particulars, which of course there was that lovely debate in your country, between Plato that said the universals were more important, and that led then to the deductive sciences, and then Aristotle, who decided that particulars were more important, and that led to the inductive sciences. Well, if we're going towards a universal or a global information ecology, we have the scientific and technical knowledge and the cultural and historical knowledge. On this side, we have all kinds of things that are happening. We have industry foundation classes, the standard for the exchange of product information, STEP, and that's part of a larger project called Intelligent Manufacturing Systems, where we have about 550 million a year now on this thing. Now again, I'm going to play Socrates. I'm not saying we don't need this side. I'm saying that the answer is in a link between the two. And let me give you a concrete example. We have now, in England, for example, the bow and arrow project. And oh dear, this is where your colleagues sometimes frustrate me, because bow is the building objects warehouse, and arrow is another one of these things. But what it boils down to is I get the universal characteristics of a building object. So this really started with the industry foundation classes. As you know, about 20 years ago, when I was building a door with AutoCAD, I'd have to draw every line painfully, and it was an awful experience. And then they got to the notion of intelligent doors and intelligent windows. What does this mean? I start to draw this thing, but I say, this is a door in the Opera Hotel. And it immediately knows this hotel is X floors high, therefore the stresses and so on and so forth, and it immediately draws itself. Well, this is excellent, because we can then build into those things something that draws the door and immediately tells me what stress levels and ratios I need to fit with the international codes of security and safety, so that I don't have to be faced with Hammurabi's laws about buildings collapsing that I've built. But it will tell me nothing about the greatness of the doors of San Zeno or of those doors of Ghiberti in Florence. Or to take a completely different example, and one that interests me, and this I use as an example to just tickle you into reflecting, how do we actually get this to happen in your domain? And it's in a domain that's so far away from your everyday activities that it shouldn't be a threat. The domain is what's called Elizabethan architecture in England, although the tradition is far older. It's called Fachwerk in German. Don't try saying that after too many wines. But what's fascinating about this is that here's an example from Lavenham, Farnham. Here's one from Bamberg and Old Hanover. Here's one from Marburg and Hildesheim. Here's one from Wolfenbüttel. That's where a friend lives, and this is, of course, Klopstock's house, who had nice fights with Lessing, not Lessig, but Lessing, in Quedlinburg, which was, of course, the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor around 800. That's where the Ottonian Empire got started after the Carolingians moved from Aachen. What interests me in this example of Fachwerk is that we have a so-called standard. We know that we need a bit of wood in a regular pattern, and then we put some stucco in between. That's the obvious part. But the fascinating part, and this I think is the real clincher, this is done in such a way that any expert can immediately tell you that that has to be in Quedlinburg and nowhere else in the world. Let us say, you have a rule, how you make Fachwerk or Elizabethan, but every town in Europe made a version that is unique to that town. So that in Chester is very different from Hornburg, or the ones in Rouen in France, where there are still several kilometers of these, or in Altenburg, or Erfurt, where I was last week. All of these, every town has its own. Now, how can we create standards? How can we create access that doesn't just tell us the rules for the architecture of Fachwerk or so on, but that gets us all this complexity? Now, my tentative answer is that we need two kinds of databases. We need the intelligent manufacturing systems that tells me what are the basic rules for making this thing. And that's the part you're already doing, because you know that's important and you're spending hundreds of millions. But my talk today was about that other side that you hadn't thought about. Namely, what we really need is pictures of all those thousands of different examples to shake up the less creative amongst your customers and users, so that they can realize that by taking the standards, they can apply something that will create a different and unique version in every city. This is a very interesting city in that respect, because here we are in a city with great history, but was also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if you look at it more closely, it is really an imitation of many Renaissance themes from Italy. Of course, if you go to the old part of town, you'll realize that whereas in Italy the buildings were actually built this way, here they took the old medieval things and just put nice stucco plaster to make it look like they were copying that muster. But even so, Budapest did it different than Vienna, and this place did it different from both, and again created this uniqueness, although there are themes that we can recognize as standard Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we could do the same thing, but it would be more complicated in Japan, and in China it would be more complicated again. Or if you go to Nepal and look at the royal cities, you can have examples, but then it's this variety. So how can we create databases for the richness and variety that link somehow with the databases for the universals and the particulars? So a colleague of mine at the Consiglio Nazionale delle Ricerche, Istituto Tecnologia per Applicati alle Beni Culturali, the National Research Center just outside of Rome, is working on the notion of virtual heritage centers where all these different things might come into place. And one of the thoughts is that we could create, say, 8, 10, 15 centers to do initial experiments at the gigabit level linked with Géant, and then link this with eCultureNet, which is the thing that I'm working on, which at the moment has, well, we've put in a bid to have 132 institutions linking 537 individuals in Europe, and with a few in Japan, Russia, Canada, and so on, so that we could start in a concrete way to work on this, so that we can put these objects into context, see not only the ruin, but the reconstructions in augmented and enhanced reality. We need this grid for culture that can build on some of the applications where appropriate from the e-science grid. This can lead to centers of excellence and lead to a European research area, but in fact become the basis of a world research area. Ladies and gentlemen, I realize that traveling around the world so quickly can give indigestion in more than one way, but I hope to have reminded you that in the world of culture, in a world that some of you think of as just those statues locked away in museums where they belong, that there is an enormous richness that if we deal with it properly is much more than just putting a few images on the web. Because if we do this right, it will give us insights into completely different ways of thinking. That a Japanese person thinks about the world, in fact, even the way they formulate their language is fundamentally different than the way we do it, or the Chinese do it, or the Russians do it, and so on. And if we can learn that in this cultural diversity, or the unity of diversities, as Giorgio Ruffalo of the European Parliament likes to call it, if we can do that, we have a way of a new kind of tolerance, because we're not just saying, oh, they think differently than me, therefore they're wrong, or they didn't agree with me on the last decision, therefore they're my enemy, which is a tendency that we're finding in certain places, unnamed, of course, in certain places across certain ponds. And it seems to me that unless we find ways to get that richness, that way of using your technologies not to impose the centralized view, which was once the idea, but in fact the distributed view that distributes tolerance and understanding, then, ladies and gentlemen, the enormous, noble efforts that drive you to create your incredible networks will not be in vain. Thank you.